Shady Sands, the cradle of the new California Republic, began as a fragile settlement in the wastes of post-nuclear California, and its story represents the improbable rise of civilization from ashes, where once only chaos and ruin reigned. In the aftermath of the Great War of 2077, when nuclear fire consumed the world and collapsed every government, institution, and city that had once brought stability, a scattering of survivors struggled to endure in the irradiated deserts and ruins of the West Coast. And among these were the ancestors of those who would later form the village of Shady Sands, ordinary men and women who had survived not because of superior weaponry or technology, but because of perseverance, grit, and the sheer refusal to succumb to despair. These people carved out a meager existence in the wasteland by salvaging, farming, and trading with nomads. But it was their settlement, founded in the remains of pre-war structures in the northern Mojave and southern California region, that would become the kernel of hope around which a future republic would take shape. Shady Sands was led in its early years by Aradesh, a man of Indian heritage and a Vault 15 refugee, whose leadership combined caution with a vision for stability, and it was under his guidance that the settlement began to transform from a vulnerable hamlet into a community with aspirations greater than mere survival. Aradesh's pragmatic leadership was complemented by his daughter Tandy, who even in her youth exhibited qualities of courage, insight, and charisma that would later make her one of the most significant political figures in the post-war world. But in the early days of Shady Sands, survival was always tenuous, threatened constantly by raiders, mutated beasts, and the scarcity of food and clean water, and it is within this crucible that Shady Sands people forged a culture of mutual reliance and communal responsibility that would lay the groundwork for the institutions of the NCR. One of the defining moments in these formative years was the encounter between the villagers of Shady Sands and the Vault Dweller, the hero of Fallout, who journeyed from Vault 13 Inch's search of a water purification chip and found himself entangled in the destinies of many communities, including Shady Sands, and it was through his actions, whether helping to free Tandy from the Khans, a tribe of violent raiders led by Garl Deathhand, or assisting in establishing defenses against the constant raider and mutant threats, that the village was able to stabilize long enough to dream of a future beyond subsistence. This interaction with the Vault Dweller was more than a passing episode, for it introduced Shady Sands to the concept that alliances and assistance could be sought beyond the village walls, and it fostered the idea that cooperation, rather than isolation, might be the path to long-term survival. Unlike other wasteland settlements that degenerated into tyranny, barbarism, or stagnation, Shady Sands maintained a fragile but deliberate sense of order, practicing primitive but genuine democracy by holding community meetings where every villager's voice could be heard, and this experiment in participatory governance was both a reflection of necessity and a foreshadowing of the republic to come. The settlement's physical growth was modest, little more than adobe huts, a Brahmin pen, and a handful of crop fields cultivated with difficulty in irradiated soil, but symbolically, it represented something far larger, a deliberate attempt to restore the lost concept of community in a shattered world. Shady Sands' early survival was inextricably linked with the fate of Vault 15, a vault designed as a social experiment, where 4 different and often antagonistic ethnic groups were sealed together to test whether cooperation could emerge from enforced diversity, and while the vault itself eventually fractured, sending its disparate groups into the wasteland, Shady Sands absorbed some of these refugees, and preserved certain traditions of negotiation and compromise, embedding within its fabric a culture that prized discussion, mediation, and collective decision-making over brute force. This distinction set Shady Sands apart from raider encampments and petty warlord states that dotted the wasteland, and it made the village an appealing partner for travelers and merchants who passed through the area along the trade routes that were slowly being re-established between surviving communities. Still, Shady Sands faced relentless challenges, from the Khans who kidnapped and terrorized settlers to the growing menace of the supermutants marshaled by the Master, and it is a testament to the resilience of Aradesh's leadership and the villagers' commitment that the community endured where so many others perished. The presence of the Vault Dweller was catalytic in this period, for his aid not only secured Tandy's safe return and bolstered Shady Sands' defenses, but also inspired confidence among the villagers that their community could aspire to more than bare subsistence. And when the Master's unity was eventually destroyed through the Vault Dweller's intervention, it removed a looming existential threat that might otherwise have swept Shady Sands away. With peace, however fragile, the settlement could turn inward to focus on building institutions, codifying rules, and establishing structures that would outlast any one leader. Aradesh, while cautious, was a visionary in his own right, understanding that survival in the wasteland required more than weapons and walls. It demanded governance, law, and the cultivation of shared identity among people who otherwise had little to bind them. Thus, in the late 2100 seconds and early 2200 seconds, Shady Sands began laying down the roots of what would become the new California Republic, drafting rudimentary codes of law, experimenting with elected councils, and establishing systems for distributing resources equitably. It is important to note that Shady Sands' development was not inevitable nor guaranteed. Many settlements attempted similar experiments and failed, undone by internal strife, external assault, or simple scarcity, but the convergence of leadership, geography, and timely assistance allowed Shady Sands to transcend the fate of so many others. Its location, close enough to Vault 15 to absorb useful technology and knowledge, yet far enough from the irradiated ruins of major cities like Los Angeles to avoid constant predation, proved advantageous, and the character of its leaders, particularly Aradesh and later Tandy, provided continuity and vision. When future generations of NCR citizens looked back on their history, Shady Sands became enshrined as the birthplace not merely of their republic but of civilization's rebirth itself, a symbolic capital that embodied the transition from anarchy to order, from survival to governance, and from isolation to federation. In sum, the origins of Shady Sands were humble, fragile, and fraught with danger. But it was precisely this crucible of hardship that forged the communal values, democratic instincts, and vision of progress that would, in time, expand outward and blossom into the largest post-war nation in the fallout world, the new California Republic. The transformation of Shady Sands from a modest post-war settlement into the formalized new California Republic was neither abrupt nor inevitable, but rather the culmination of decades of incremental, political, social, and cultural development shaped by both necessity and vision. And at the heart of this transformation lay the principle that survival was no longer enough, that civilization could and must be rebuilt upon the ruins of the old world. In the early 2200 seconds, following the death of Aradesh, leadership of Shady Sands passed to his daughter Tandy, who, though once the kidnapped teenager rescued by the Vault Dweller, had grown into a woman of extraordinary resilience, pragmatism, and charisma, embodying both the folk wisdom of the wasteland and the visionary zeal of a true stateswoman, and it was under her guidance that the settlement transitioned from a village to a polity, with institutions capable of governing beyond its walls. The initial steps toward republicanism were pragmatic: formal councils to regulate disputes, agricultural quotas to ensure equitable distribution, and patrols to guard trade routes. But as Shady Sands prospered and its population grew, these systems became increasingly codified, laying the groundwork for a constitutional government. One of the earliest documents, the Charter of Shady Sands, outlined basic rights of free citizens, guaranteed representation in local councils, and established a rudimentary legal system rooted in both pre-war democratic ideals and the exigencies of wasteland survival. And this charter, though crude, would eventually evolve into the Constitution of the new California Republic, a document that formalized the structures of governance, balanced powers between the executive and legislative branches, and enshrined the principle of collective defense and mutual prosperity. The decision to adopt the name New California Republic was itself symbolic, a deliberate invocation of the pre-war state of California and its democratic traditions, meant to signal both continuity with the old world and a commitment to surpassing its failures. And in choosing this name, the founders sought to inspire unity among diverse settlements by offering not simply protection, but participation in a shared project of renewal. Shady Sands' status as the capital was a natural extension of its role as the birthplace of this movement. And though it lacked the grandeur of pre-war cities, its modest adobe buildings and growing institutions became the center of diplomacy, lawmaking, and military planning, embodying the Republic's ethos that progress did not require skyscrapers or vast armies, but rather commitment to principles of governance. The process of expansion was gradual but decisive, beginning with alliances with nearby communities like Junktown, the Hub, and the remnants of Vault 15, where negotiations combined promises of trade, security, military protection, and shared governance. Unlike warlords and raider kings who demanded tribute through violence, the NCR offered a model of voluntary integration, allowing communities to retain a degree of autonomy while participating in a larger federal structure. And this diplomatic approach proved far more effective in building durable alliances than brute force ever could. Still, the NCR was not without coercive elements, for its growing military, originally little more than local militias and volunteer patrols, was gradually formalized into a standing army, supported by the Desert Rangers, whose merger with the NCR military brought professionalism and experience to the Republic's forces. This military strength, combined with economic incentives, made NCR membership both appealing and difficult to resist. For communities surrounded by hostile raiders, or in need of secure trade found in the Republic, both protection and prosperity. The formation of the Senate and the office of the President formalized political power, with Tandy becoming the Republic's most famous and longest-serving president, her tenure stretching well beyond a century thanks to advances in medicine and the sheer will of a figure regarded by many as the living embodiment of the Republic itself. Under her guidance, the NCR codified its legal framework, established courts, standardized currency, and began the ambitious project of reconstructing infrastructure such as roads, farms, and water systems, all of which contributed to its transformation from a loose coalition of settlements into a genuine nation-state. one cannot overstate the significance of the NCR Constitution, which not only outlined the powers of the federal government, but also enshrined rights such as free speech, due process, and representation, reflecting both the influence of pre-war American ideals and the lived experiences of wastelanders who had suffered under tyranny and lawlessness. At the same time, however, the Republic was pragmatic, embedding within its structure allowances for emergency powers, military authority, and executive decrees, recognizing that the unpredictable dangers of the wasteland required flexibility that pure idealism could not sustain. The growth of the NCR's territory was marked by both triumphs and tensions, as new member states brought wealth, resources, and diversity, but also introduced conflicts over representation, taxation, and the balance of local autonomy versus central authority. Despite these challenges, the Republic's vision resonated broadly, and by the mid-2200 seconds it encompassed much of central and southern California, unifying trade hubs, farming communities, and military outposts into a coherent federal structure. Central to this expansion was the Republic's economic model, which prioritized agriculture and trade, with Brahmin ranchers, caravan companies, and farmers forming the backbone of both wealth and political influence. And though this created tensions with less agrarian communities, it provided the surplus necessary to support a standing military and bureaucratic apparatus. The Republic's leadership recognized early on that legitimacy required not just force or prosperity, but also the cultivation of identity. And so the symbols of the NCR, its flag with the two-headed bear, its coinage, and its rhetoric of democracy, were deliberately designed to foster loyalty and pride among its citizens, casting the Republic not merely as a state, but as the rebirth of civilization itself. Tandy, in particular, understood the power of narrative, and her speeches often invoked both the memory of the Vault Dweller as the savior of Shady Sands and the broader struggle of wastelanders to rise above anarchy, weaving a story that made every citizen feel part of a heroic arc of renewal. Thus, the transition from Shady Sands to the NCR was not simply administrative or territorial, but profoundly cultural, for it replaced the ethos of survivalism with one of civic duty, replacing the question of how do we endure with how do we govern ourselves together. Yet, even in these early days, contradictions emerged, as the Republic's democratic ideals clashed with the realities of power concentrated in the hands of Brahmin barons, caravan magnates, and a political elite centered in Shady Sands, foreshadowing tensions that would grow as the Republic expanded further. Nevertheless, the creation of the NCR marked the first serious attempt in post-apocalyptic America to re-establish Republican governance, and while imperfect, corruptible, and beset by challenges, it stood as proof that humanity's capacity for order, cooperation, and vision had not been extinguished by the bombs. And in the dusty streets of Shady Sands, under the leadership of Tandy and the principles enshrined in its constitution, the seeds of a republic were sown, seeds that would spread outward to shape the politics, wars, and destinies of the entire West Coast wasteland for generations to come. Tandy's presidency was the era that defined the new California Republic, the period during which it transformed from a fledgling coalition of settlements into the dominant power of the post-nuclear West, and her extraordinary longevity, coupled with her iron determination, made her both a symbol and an architect of the Republic's ideals, even as the contradictions of its expansion began to emerge. born in Shady Sands before the Republic even existed, and rescued as a teenager by the Vault Dweller from the clutches of Garl Deathhand and his Khans, Tundi grew up witnessing firsthand both the fragility of human survival and the transformative potential of cooperation. And it was these early experiences that shaped her governing philosophy, one that combined fierce pragmatism with a genuine belief in democracy, though always tempered by the knowledge that ideals must adapt to survive the wasteland. After succeeding her father, Aradesh, Tundi rose from local leadership into the Republic's first true stateswoman, guiding the NCR through its infancy with a steady hand, and her eventual election to the presidency enshrined her as the central figure in its political life for more than a century, thanks in part to advanced medical care, but more crucially to her unshakable will to serve until the day she died. Under her leadership, the NCR expanded rapidly, absorbing communities such as Junktown, The Hub, Dayglow, Maxon, and even integrating Vault 15's successor communities, and this growth was not achieved solely by conquest, but through a combination of diplomacy, military intervention, and the promise of shared prosperity. Tundi was shrewd enough to recognize that the NCR's legitimacy required a careful balance between offering protection to struggling communities and enforcing laws that bound them into the Republic's political structure, and while she preached democracy and representation, she also wielded the NCR's growing military with decisive force against raiders, slavers, and hostile tribes who refused to accept order, ensuring that the Republic's vision of civilization would not be threatened by lawless forces on its borders. One of her key achievements was strengthening the Desert Rangers' integration into the NCR military, formalizing their role as the Republic's elite lawmen and scouts, and this merger not only professionalized the army, but also extended the Republic's reach into the Mojave and beyond. Internally, Tundi presided over the codification of the NCR Constitution, the establishment of a bicameral legislature, the construction of a functioning judiciary, and the creation of bureaucratic institutions capable of managing taxation, trade, and infrastructure, all of which turned the NCR from a loose confederation into a structured state. Yet her presidency was not merely about systems of governance, it was also a period of ideological consolidation, during which the NCR defined itself not only as a political entity, but as a moral project, the rebirth of democracy in a world that had lost all memory of it, and Tundi's speeches, preserved in fragments, reveal her constant emphasis on collective duty, on the Republic as something larger than any one leader or settlement. She invoked the memory of the Vault Dweller as a symbol of selflessness, linking the Republic's founding myth to the actions of a hero whose aid to Shady Sands had once allowed her people to survive, and in so doing, she ensured that the NCR's identity was inseparable from the idea of sacrifice for the common good. But while Tundi's vision was inspiring, her presidency was not free from the compromises and flaws that come with power, for, as the Republic expanded, it increasingly relied on taxation, bureaucracy, and centralized control, creating resentment among frontier communities who viewed Shady Sands politicians as out of touch with wasteland realities. Moreover, the Republic's economic foundation, heavily reliant on Brahmin ranchers and caravan companies, concentrated wealth and political influence in the hands of a few, breeding corruption and political patronage, even as the rhetoric of equality and democracy remained central to Tundi's message. She was not blind to these tensions, but she viewed them as the inevitable growing pains of a young republic, believing that time and civic culture would smooth the rough edges. Throughout her presidency, The NCR faced numerous external challenges, including ongoing conflicts with raider groups, skirmishes with the Khans, and territorial disputes with the Brotherhood of Steel, whose technological isolationism clashed with the Republic's vision of collective progress. And it was during Tandy's later years that the NCR's confrontations with the Enclave began to escalate, culminating eventually in the Battle of Navarro, where the combined efforts of Wastelanders and NCR forces eradicated one of the last remnants of America's pre-war government in exile. Tandy's role in fostering these alliances was critical, for she recognized the importance of uniting diverse communities and factions under a single banner, even when their interests did not always align, and it was this talent for coalition building that allowed the NCR to outlast its enemies and consolidate its hold over California. Personally, Tandy was known as a blunt, no-nonsense figure, unafraid to chastise her own officials, and she cultivated a reputation as both a grandmotherly figure and a formidable political operator, one who inspired loyalty, not through fear, but through the sheer force of her presence. When citizens thought of the Republic, they thought of Tandy, and this conflation of leader and state, though stabilizing in the short term, also meant that her eventual passing would create uncertainty about whether the Republic could endure without her guiding hand. Indeed, one of the paradoxes of her presidency was that even as she preached the principles of republicanism and collective governance, her extraordinary longevity and dominance in politics made the NCR appear more like a benevolent monarchy than a rotating democracy. Yet, because she was genuinely committed to the Republic's ideals, she resisted the temptation to convert her authority into outright dictatorship, instead nurturing institutions that could outlive her, and for this reason, her presidency is remembered less as an era of autocracy than as the foundation of Republican stability. By the time of her death in 2248, at the remarkable age of 103, Tandy had become not just a leader, but a legend, her face and voice etched into the memory of every NCR citizen, her name synonymous with survival, democracy, and expansion. And though the Republic would struggle in the years after her passing with corruption, inefficiency, and overreach, it would always return to her example as the golden standard of leadership. In retrospect, Tandy's presidency stands as both the high point of the NCR's idealism and the beginning of its contradictions. For while she oversaw the creation of the largest, most successful government in the post-apocalyptic world, she also set in motion patterns of expansion, bureaucracy, and economic inequality that would haunt the Republic in later generations. Yet, to reduce her legacy to these contradictions would be to misunderstand the scope of her achievement. For Tandy's presidency proved that democracy could survive even in the harshest of wastelands, and it offered hope to countless survivors that humanity could rise again, not merely as isolated settlements or armed bands, but as a united people governed by laws, ideals, and the belief that tomorrow could be better than today. The development of the new California Republic's military and its eventual merger with the legendary Desert Rangers was one of the most decisive factors in transforming the Republic from a fragile coalition of settlements into a true nation-state capable of defending its borders, projecting power, and shaping the political landscape of the wasteland. For while the NCR prided itself on democracy and law, those ideals could not survive without the protection of armed men and women willing to fight and die to preserve them. In its earliest days, Shady Sands relied on local militias composed of farmers, Brahmin herders, and volunteers, men and women armed with scavenged weapons, and bound together by little more than desperation and communal loyalty. And while this sufficed to ward off raiders and protect the village from small-scale threats, it was clear that if the Republic wished to expand and protect trade routes, it would require a professionalized force. Thus, under Tandy's leadership, the NCR Army was born, gradually evolving from ragtag militias into a structured organization with ranks, training regiments, and standardized equipment. And as the Republic expanded, the army became the glue that held together distant member states, ensuring that the promises of democracy and shared prosperity were not empty words, but guarantees backed by force. The establishment of the NCR military was not merely a defensive necessity, but a political project, for the presence of uniformed troops patrolling settlements, building outposts, and garrisoning forts symbolized the Republic's legitimacy and projected an image of order in a world dominated by chaos. Yet building such a force was a monumental challenge in a wasteland starved of resources, manufacturing, and professional officers. The NCR compensated by recruiting heavily from its own citizens, offering pay, rations, and a sense of belonging, and by standardizing its use of salvaged pre-war equipment, particularly service rifles and combat armor, often reverse-engineered and crudely manufactured in growing workshops around Shady Sands and the Hub. As the army expanded, however, its limitations became apparent, for while it was effective against raiders and tribes, it struggled against more organized and technologically advanced foes, most notably the Brotherhood of Steel, whose power-armored paladins and advanced energy weapons repeatedly humbled NCR forces in skirmishes, demonstrating that discipline and numbers alone were not enough. It was in this context that the Desert Rangers, a separate but venerable institution predating the NCR itself, came to play a decisive role. The Rangers were originally a loosely organized group of lawmen and survivalists who traced their lineage back to pre-war traditions of the Texas Rangers and other frontier law enforcement, and they operated across the wastelands of the Southwest, dedicated not to personal gain, but to the preservation of justice, order, and the protection of ordinary people from the predations of raiders, slavers, and warlords. Their reputation was legendary, for a ranger's badge was both a symbol of honor and a death sentence for those who preyed on the weak, and their commitment to justice often placed them in direct conflict with groups like the Khans, the Vipers, and the Jackals, against whom they waged a relentless guerrilla war. When the NCR began to expand eastward into the Mojave and encountered the Rangers, there was initial suspicion, for the Rangers valued their independence and were wary of becoming enforcers for a distant government, yet Tandy and her successors recognized that the Republic and the Rangers shared common ideals, and that an alliance would not only strengthen the NCR militarily, but also legitimize it morally, for the Rangers embodied the same mythos of frontier justice and self-sacrifice that the Republic claimed to uphold. After years of cooperation in the field and negotiations at the political level, the two forces formally merged through the Ranger Unification Treaty, signed in 2271 at Hoover Dam, a document that brought the Desert Rangers under the NCR banner while preserving their identity and traditions. This treaty was more than symbolic, for it granted the NCR not only experienced scouts, sharpshooters, and survivalists, but also the mantle of legitimacy that came with the Ranger legacy, and in exchange, the Rangers received the resources and manpower of the Republic to continue their mission on a larger scale. The merger fundamentally reshaped the NCR's military, for while the army remained the backbone of conventional warfare, the Rangers became its eyes, ears, and moral compass, operating as elite units tasked with reconnaissance, counterinsurgency, and special operations deep in hostile territory. Together, the Army and the Rangers provided the Republic with a dual structure of force projection: the Army to garrison towns, build forts, and fight pitched battles, and the Rangers to move unseen, strike at enemies before they could threaten civilians, and inspire fear among raiders and slavers who knew that a single ranger could spell doom for an entire band. This combination of conventional might and elite precision allowed the NCR to expand far beyond its original heartland, securing trade routes, suppressing resistance, and confronting enemies as formidable as Caesar's legion and the Enclave. Yet the rise of the NCR military also introduced new challenges, for as the army grew, it became increasingly bureaucratic, plagued by inefficiency, corruption, and political interference, with officers often promoted more for loyalty to powerful families or politicians than for battlefield merit, and supplies frequently siphoned off by profiteers or lost to incompetence. A stark contrast to the Rangers' Spartan ethos and incorruptible reputation. These tensions between the professional soldiers of the Rangers and the bureaucratic mass of the Army would persist, with Rangers often frustrated by the Army's sluggishness and unwillingness to act decisively, while Army officials sometimes resented the Rangers' autonomy and prestige. Still, the partnership endured, because both sides understood that survival demanded cooperation, and despite flaws, the NCR military proved capable of securing the Republic's frontiers, defeating major threats, and giving substance to the ideals of democracy and order that otherwise would have remained abstract. The human cost of this military expansion was immense, with countless NCR citizens conscripted or volunteering for service, often spending years garrisoning far-flung outposts in hostile territory, facing not only raiders and supermutants, but also the grinding hardships of disease, poor supplies, and isolation. Yet their sacrifices were woven into the Republic's narrative of collective duty, reinforcing the belief that citizenship required not just rights, but also obligations. By the time of the First Battle of Hoover Dam, the NCR military had become a massive institution, fielding tens of thousands of troops, supported by logistics networks, supply caravans, and fortified bases, while the Rangers operated as a highly mobile elite corps, striking at Legion scouts, sabotaging enemy positions, and rallying frontier communities to the Republic's cause. In retrospect, the development of the NCR's military and its alliance with the Desert Rangers was perhaps the single most important factor in ensuring the Republic's survival and expansion, for without the ability to defend its ideals with force, the NCR would have been just another failed experiment in governance, swept aside by stronger powers. But because it combined the mass of an army with the spirit of the Rangers, it endured, projecting power across California, the Mojave, and beyond, and establishing itself as the dominant post-war nation in the fallout world. The Mojave Campaign marked the boldest and most ambitious expansion in the history of the new California Republic, a campaign that would not only test the limits of the Republic's military and political institutions, but also expose the contradictions at the heart of its ideology. For while the NCR preached democracy, prosperity, and shared destiny, its push into the Mojave wasteland revealed an appetite for territory, resources, and strategic dominance that rivaled any empire of the Old World. The origins of the Mojave Campaign lay in the Republic's insatiable need for growth, driven by a swelling population, an economy increasingly dependent on trade, and a political system that rewarded expansion as both a symbol of legitimacy and a practical necessity. For every new community integrated into the NCR, provided tax revenue, farmland, and soldiers to sustain its sprawling bureaucracy and military machine. By the mid-2200s, the Republic had consolidated most of California and was pressing eastward, eyeing the fertile lands, trade arteries, and untapped resources of Nevada. And it was here that the Mojave, a harsh desert cut through by the remnants of Interstate 15 and bisected by the life-giving Colorado River, became the next frontier. The Mojave was no empty wilderness, but a contested land, inhabited by independent towns like Primm and Goodsprings, tribal remnants, caravan companies, and most significantly, the glittering ruins of New Vegas, where the enigmatic figure of Mr. House had reawakened ancient technologies to secure his dominion over the Strip and the Hoover Dam, the single most valuable piece of infrastructure in the post-war world. Hoover Dam, a marvel of pre-war engineering, represented more than just a source of hydroelectric power. It was a symbol of civilization itself, capable of lighting cities, powering industry, and providing irrigation to turn desert into farmland. And to the NCR, it represented both the key to sustaining its growing population and the prize that would secure its supremacy over all rivals. Thus, when scouts, caravans, and rangers first pushed into the Mojave, they did so with a dual mission: to bring the Republic's law to a new frontier and to secure the dam as a strategic asset. The campaign began with cautious steps, as NCR forces established Mojave Outpost, Camp Forlorn Hope, and other garrisons along key trade routes, seeking to protect caravans and settlers from raiders and hostile tribes. And at first, the NCR framed its presence as a stabilizing force, offering protection in exchange for loyalty. Yet beneath this rhetoric lay the hard reality that the Republic intended to incorporate the Mojave into its territory, regardless of the wishes of its inhabitants. Local reactions were mixed. Some settlers welcomed the protection and trade opportunities that NCR troops brought, while others resented the heavy-handed bureaucracy, taxation, and sense of being governed by distant politicians in Shady Sands who neither understood nor cared about local realities. These tensions foreshadowed deeper conflicts to come, but for the moment, the Republic pressed forward, convinced that its institutions and ideals were universally beneficial and that resistance could be managed. The real challenge, however, emerged not from the locals but from Caesar's legion, the brutal, expansionist slaver empire that had risen east of the Colorado under the leadership of the enigmatic Caesar, who had forged dozens of tribes into a disciplined war machine, guided by an ideology of conquest, obedience, and martial supremacy. When the NCR first encountered the legion, it was shocked by the ferocity and organization of this seemingly tribal force. For, unlike raiders or supermutants, the Legion fought with discipline, coordination, and an iron will, and its brutality struck terror into both civilians and soldiers alike. The Mojave thus became the stage for a collision between two visions of post-war civilization, the NCR's model of democracy, bureaucracy, and expansion by law, and the Legion's model of autocracy, slavery, and conquest by fire and sword. And at the center of this looming confrontation stood Hoover Dam, the prize both empires coveted above all else. As the NCR poured more troops and resources into the Mojave, the campaign quickly escalated beyond a simple frontier expansion into a full-scale war of position, with rangers and soldiers clashing against Legion forces in bloody skirmishes along the Colorado, While behind the front lines, the NCR struggled to win hearts and minds in New Vegas and its surrounding communities. The Republic's generals, schooled in conventional warfare, often found themselves stymied by the Legion's guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and ruthless psychological warfare, while NCR bureaucrats attempted to impose taxes, laws, and regulations on settlers who resented their interference and often sympathized with Mr. House's vision of an independent Vegas. The logistical challenges of the Mojave campaign were immense, as every rifle, ration, and reinforcement had to be hauled across vast stretches of desert from California, leaving outposts perpetually undersupplied and soldiers demoralized. Yet despite these hardships, the Republic pressed on, convinced that victory would cement its destiny as the heir to pre-war America. Within the NCR itself, the campaign became a political lightning rod, with expansionists hailing it as proof of the Republic's strength and manifest destiny, while critics decried it as imperial overreach that drained resources from the heartland and subjected citizens to taxation and conscription for a war far from home. Tandy's successors, lacking her legendary authority, struggled to balance these competing pressures, and though they remained committed to the campaign, their administrations were increasingly characterized by compromise, corruption, and inefficiency, leaving the soldiers in the plate, Mojave, to bear the brunt of leadership's shortcomings. Nevertheless, the campaign continued, for the stakes were too high to abandon, and as the NCR entrenched itself around Hoover Dam and on the outskirts of New Vegas, it became clear that the fate of the Mojave would not be decided by skirmishes or negotiations, but by a decisive confrontation between the Republic, the Legion, and the enigmatic figure of Mr. House, whose machinations ensured that no outcome would leave the NCR entirely unchallenged. Thus, the Mojave campaign began as an extension of the Republic's frontier expansion, but quickly evolved into an existential struggle that would define its destiny, testing not only its military strength, but the very ideals upon which it was founded, and in doing so it exposed the fault lines within the NCR itself, raising the question of whether the Republic was truly a beacon of democracy and renewal, or merely another empire grasping for power in the ashes of the old world. The new California Republic's rise to regional dominance was never a smooth march of democratic ideals and orderly governance, but rather a ceaseless struggle against the countless raiders, gangs, and tribes that occupied the wastes of California, Nevada, and beyond. For the Republic could not expand without first taming or absorbing the disparate groups that filled the post-apocalyptic landscape, each with its own customs, traditions, and ambitions, many of which clashed violently with the centralized order that Shady Sands sought to impose, and so, from its earliest years, the NCR waged a long and grinding series of conflicts that would shape both its military institutions and its political philosophy. In the heartlands of California, the first adversaries were raider bands, who preyed on the fragile caravans and settlements that formed the lifeblood of the young Republic, and though their numbers were often small compared to the organized armies of later years, their unpredictability, brutality, and familiarity with the terrain made them a constant menace, forcing the NCR to develop not only its standing army, but also its Ranger Corps into hardened frontier defenders who learned to fight as much with patience and cunning as with superior firepower. Among these raider groups, none were more infamous than the Khans, a lineage of tribals who had endured since the days of the Vault Dweller, their culture defined by violence, plunder, and a fierce warrior ethos that both repelled and fascinated their enemies. And though the Khans suffered devastating defeats at the hands of the Vault Dweller in the first Fallout, and later the Chosen One, their legacy persisted in splinter groups such as the Great Khans, who would come to play a significant role in the Mojave. The NCR's early encounters with the Khans demonstrated the Republic's twin impulses: on the one hand, to crush hostile groups militarily when they posed a threat, and on the other, to attempt integration when politically convenient, offering defeated tribes a place within the Republic, as long as they abandoned their old ways and swore loyalty to its institutions. This approach was similarly applied to other tribes scattered across California, from smaller nomadic groups who were gradually absorbed into farming communities, to larger, more organized entities whose resistance often required sustained campaigns to break. Yet not all tribes were destined for destruction or assimilation, for in the desert ranges of Nevada, the NCR found a kindred spirit, a group of disciplined warriors dedicated to preserving order in the wasteland. And, rather than fighting them, the Republic eventually negotiated an alliance and absorption of the Rangers into the NCR military structure, a development that greatly strengthened the Republic's frontier capabilities, while also symbolizing its willingness to adapt and forge partnerships when doing so served its interests. Still, such alliances were the exception rather than the rule. And for every ranger that joined the Republic, there were dozens of tribes and raiders who resisted fiercely, sometimes forming coalitions to counter the encroaching tide of NCR expansion. The Mojave itself was a mosaic of these conflicts, for before the NCR ever clashed with Caesar's Legion, it had to contend with raiders like the Fiends, drug-addled marauders who terrorized the outskirts of New Vegas and forced the NCR to divert soldiers from the front lines to protect settlers, as well as the powder gangers, convicts armed and emboldened after escaping NCR prisons, whose rebellion highlighted the dangers of overextension and the limits of NCR control. To the Republic's leadership, such groups were not only nuisances but also political liabilities. For every attack on a caravan or settlement under NCR protection undermined its claim of providing security and prosperity to its citizens, and thus vast resources were poured into pacification campaigns that often devolved into brutal wars of attrition. The tribes of Nevada, meanwhile, posed a different challenge, for many were less overtly hostile than raiders, but no less resistant to integration, holding fast to their traditions and rejecting the centralized governance, taxation, and military conscription demanded by Shady Sands. Some of these tribes, like the Mojave's more peaceful groups, were eventually swayed or coerced into alignment with the NCR, while others were displaced, destroyed, or driven into the arms of Caesar's Legion, whose promise of unity under a strong hand resonated with those who saw in the NCR only bureaucracy and hypocrisy. The Republic's handling of these conflicts revealed the tension at its core. While it claimed to be spreading democracy and law, in practice, it often resorted to conquest, coercion, and the erasure of local cultures, leaving behind a trail of resentment that would haunt it in the Mojave campaign and beyond. Indeed, the Great Khan's fate in the Mojave exemplified this dynamic, for once again the NCR sought to crush them after their alliance with the Fiends and their hostility to NCR rule, driving them into exile and deepening the cycle of enmity that had persisted since the days of the Vault Dweller. These conflicts were not without cost to the NCR itself, for each battle drained manpower, supplies, and political capital, fueling dissent within the Republic's heartland where citizens questioned why their sons and daughters were dying in deserts far from home, and why their taxes were funding endless wars against peoples who seemed to spring up faster than they could be subdued. Yet despite these costs, the NCR's expansion continued, propelled by its conviction that it alone represented the rebirth of civilization, and that any sacrifice was justified in pursuit of this destiny. And so the Republic's clashes with raiders and tribes, though often brutal and morally ambiguous, became the crucible in which its military hardened, its bureaucracy expanded, and its identity as both savior and conqueror of the wasteland was forged, leaving behind a legacy of both security and resentment, integration and destruction that would define its reputation across the West and set the stage for its greatest trials in the wars to come. The confrontation between the new California Republic and the Enclave stands as one of the most decisive and transformative conflicts in post-war history, a clash not merely of armies, but of ideologies, for on one side stood the NCR, a fragile yet growing republic claiming to represent the rebirth of democracy and order in the wasteland, while on the other stood the Enclave, the self-proclaimed heirs to the United States government, a shadowy remnant of pre-war power that possessed advanced technology, genetic purity dogma, and an ambition to reclaim the world through extermination of all those it deemed impure. And though the NCR's role in defeating the Enclave has sometimes been overshadowed by the legendary actions of the Chosen One, the truth is that the Republic's involvement in the war both accelerated its rise to prominence and left scars that shaped its military, politics, and expansionist philosophy for decades to come. The Enclave, operating from secret bases such as the Poseidon oil rig off the coast of California and the fortified installation at Navarro, had long maintained a policy of isolation, venturing into the wasteland only to conduct raids, harvest resources, or abduct test subjects for their experiments. Yet by the late 2,240 their ambitions could no longer be contained, for they sought to unleash a modified strain of the forced evolutionary virus through the air to wipe out all mutated lifeforms, which to their ideology meant virtually all post-war humanity, thereby paving the way for a new era of pure human civilization under their control. It was this genocidal scheme that drew them into direct conflict with the NCR, for the Republic's settlements, farmers, and soldiers were among the millions of intended victims, and though the NCR at first lacked the intelligence networks to fully understand the scope of the Enclave's threat, it quickly became clear that Navarro, the Enclave's inland base, represented a clear and present danger. At Navarro, vertibirds lifted off daily to patrol skies and transport elite soldiers clad in advanced power armor, a sight that struck terror into frontier communities who had no defense against such might, and the NCR Rangers and military forces who first clashed with these patrols discovered quickly that conventional tactics were nearly useless against the Enclave's superior weaponry and discipline. Nevertheless, the NCR refused to yield, and through a combination of guerrilla raids, intelligence gathering, and alliances with local resistance groups, they began to chip away at the Enclave's regional strength. The turning point came when the Chosen One, a descendant of the Vault Dweller and hero of Arroyo, entered the fray, infiltrating Enclave operations, sabotaging their plans, and eventually leading the assault that destroyed the Poseidon oil rig itself, thereby decapitating the Enclave's leadership and halting their genocidal ambitions. Yet while the Chosen One's actions were pivotal, the NCR's contribution to the downfall of the Enclave cannot be understated, for it was NCR soldiers and rangers who bled on the ground at Navarro, who secured territory vacated by the retreating enemy, and who ultimately integrated much of the Enclave's abandoned infrastructure into the Republic's expanding military machine. Navarro itself became a prize of immense value. Its stockpiles of advanced energy weapons, vertibird technology, and power armor, forming the basis of a leap forward in NCR military capability. Though many of these technologies remained difficult to replicate or maintain without the Enclave's resources, and much of it was distributed unevenly, often hoarded by elites or used sparingly due to scarcity. Politically, the war against the Enclave provided the NCR leadership with a narrative of righteous struggle, allowing them to portray the Republic as the defender of humanity against tyrannical remnants of the old world, a framing that bolstered domestic support for further military expansion and legitimized their push into Nevada and the Mojave. Yet the war also exposed the Republic's vulnerabilities, for it became clear that while the NCR could muster large armies, its reliance on outdated weapons, strained logistics, and rigid bureaucracy made it ill-suited to face technologically superior foes, a lesson that would haunt them in later conflicts with Caesar's Legion and others. Furthermore, the Enclave War highlighted the uneasy relationship between individual heroism and collective military effort, for while the Chosen One's deeds were celebrated, the thousands of ordinary NCR soldiers who died in the campaign were often reduced to footnotes in the annals of history, their sacrifices overshadowed by the myth of a single savior. This dynamic bred frustration within the ranks, as veterans who had fought the Enclave felt that their contributions were ignored, even as politicians in Shady Sands used the war's victory to bolster their reputations and secure re-elections, a tension that fed into the growing sense of disconnect between the Republic's leadership and its rank-and-file citizens. Culturally, the war against the Enclave also reshaped the NCR's identity, for by triumphing over a faction that claimed direct continuity with the United States government, the Republic effectively crowned itself as the true heir to America's legacy, a claim it would continue to assert in rhetoric, symbols, and policies, even as its own governance drifted further into corruption and bureaucracy. The Enclave, for its part, did not vanish entirely, as scattered remnants fled into hiding, some surfacing years later in other regions such as the capital wasteland. But within the borders of the NCR, their power was broken, their bases captured or destroyed, their troops hunted down by rangers, and their ideology discredited by the sheer scale of their failure. Yet the ghost of the Enclave lingered in the Republic's consciousness, serving as both a warning and a justification, for politicians invoked the specter of a possible Enclave return to rally support for continued military readiness and expansion, while veterans whispered of the horrors they had faced against foes clad in armor that seemed unstoppable, flying machines that rained death from the skies, and weapons that could incinerate a man in an instant. Ultimately, the war with the Enclave cemented the NCR's place as the dominant power in the West. But it also set a precedent for the Republic's approach to existential threats. Overwhelming commitment of manpower, opportunistic integration of enemy technology, reliance on legendary figures to tip the balance, and afterward, a political narrative that emphasized the righteousness of its cause while papering over the costs and contradictions of its methods. A cycle that would repeat itself in the Mojave against the Legion and others. In this sense, the NCR's war with the Enclave was not only a victory, but also a rehearsal, a crucible that hardened its identity and ambitions, leaving it stronger, prouder, and yet burdened by the seeds of overconfidence and overreach that would define its future. The economy of the new California Republic, often overshadowed by its military campaigns and political expansions, was in fact one of the most critical foundations upon which the Republic's survival, stability, and growth depended, for a sprawling post-apocalyptic nation could not sustain itself solely through rhetoric or the force of arms, and the practical realities of feeding its citizens, supplying its military, and maintaining infrastructure required the creation of a functioning economic system that was both resilient to the harsh conditions of the wasteland and flexible enough to integrate a diverse array of communities, trade networks, and resources. From its origins in Shady Sands, the NCR understood that agriculture would be the backbone of its economy, and early settlers invested heavily in farming, irrigation, and land management. Using a combination of salvaged pre-war technology, Brahmin-powered plows, and careful crop rotation to coax food from irradiated soils, while local marketplaces emerged as hubs where surplus could be traded, creating a rudimentary but functional market system. As the Republic expanded, these agricultural networks became increasingly interconnected, linking settlements across central and southern California, and allowing surplus goods to flow along caravan routes to feed soldiers, settlers, and citizens alike, while simultaneously fostering interdependence that reinforced loyalty to the central government, as communities recognized that participation in the NCR brought tangible benefits, including security, access to trade, and the promise of stability. Beyond agriculture, the Republic relied heavily on caravans and merchant companies, whose drivers braved raiders, harsh terrain, and radiation to move essential goods, from food and medicine to weapons and raw materials, and these caravans became lifelines not only for commerce but also for political cohesion, as the flow of goods symbolized the tangible reach of the Republic's governance. In addition to physical trade, currency emerged as a unifying medium, with NCR credits standardizing transactions and fostering economic integration across disparate communities, providing a measure of stability in a world where bartering had previously dominated and where pre-war money had largely become worthless. Yet even as the NCR economy grew, it was never a perfect or equitable system, for wealth and power tended to concentrate in the hands of Brahmin barons, caravan magnates, and political elites in Shady Sands, who controlled the flow of goods, dictated prices, and often manipulated markets for personal advantage, creating disparities that occasionally fomented discontent in frontier settlements and among smaller communities struggling to keep pace with the Republic's growth. These inequalities, while persistent, were partially mitigated by the Republic's policy of integrating smaller communities into its economic framework, offering subsidies, security, and trade guarantees in exchange for allegiance, a policy that reinforced both dependency and loyalty, but also ensured that the NCR could claim legitimacy as a provider and stabilizer in the wasteland. Another critical element of the NCR economy was its use of natural resources, particularly water, fertile land, and irradiated salvage, which required careful management to prevent depletion, conflict, or disruption of trade. And in this regard, the Republic demonstrated considerable foresight, constructing dams, irrigation systems, and protected trade routes that became the arteries of economic life, most famously Hoover Dam, whose control of water and power in the Mojave would later define the Republic's political and military campaigns. Industrialization in the NCR was limited but growing, relying on salvaged pre-war machinery, workshops, and improvised manufacturing facilities to produce weapons, ammunition, armor, and other essentials, often concentrated in strategic hubs such as the Hub and Shady Sands, and these facilities were vital in supporting both the army and civilian populations. Though their scale could never rival the industrial power of the pre-war United States, meaning scarcity and rationing were constant concerns. The economic system also incorporated taxation, which, while modest compared to pre-war standards, became an essential tool for funding military campaigns, maintaining bureaucratic structures, and investing in infrastructure projects that facilitated further expansion. Politically, taxation created tension, as frontier communities often resisted paying into a central treasury, especially when they felt neglected or overburdened by military conscription. Yet the Republic consistently argued that such contributions were necessary for collective security and long-term prosperity, framing economic participation as both a civic duty and a path to inclusion in the Republic's vision of civilization. Trade, moreover, was not solely internal, for the NCR actively engaged in commerce with independent settlements, vaults, and even distant communities, negotiating agreements, offering protection, and sometimes coercing compliance to ensure access to critical goods and resources, and in doing so the Republic established a regional dominance, not only in politics and military might, but in the very flow of wealth and sustenance across the West Coast. Corruption, however, remained a persistent challenge, for with the concentration of economic power came opportunities for profiteering, black market trading, and exploitation, with some merchants and officials prioritizing personal gain over the welfare of citizens or soldiers, a tension that reflected the larger contradictions inherent in a rapidly expanding republic that claimed to embody egalitarian ideals while inevitably consolidating power among elites. The NCR economy was also influenced by technological legacies, including salvaged pre-war equipment, energy weapons, and infrastructure, which allowed limited industrialization, communication, and logistical coordination, providing the Republic with capabilities that many rival factions, including raiders and tribes, could not match. And this technological edge reinforced its dominance, while underscoring the disparities between the governing center and frontier peripheries. Culturally, economic participation became entwined with civic identity, as citizens came to view contributions to agriculture, caravan trade, and taxation not merely as survival necessities, but as participation in a collective enterprise, reinforcing the narrative of the NCR as the inheritor of pre-war America and the custodian of civilization in a chaotic world. The Mojave Campaign and subsequent territorial expansions further stressed the Republic's economic apparatus, forcing it to innovate in logistics, resource allocation, and supply chain management, often stretching thin the very networks that sustained communities in California. Yet each challenge was met with a combination of bureaucratic oversight, ranger protection of trade routes, and the ruthless application of military force against those who threatened commerce. In sum, the NCR economy was a complex, multifaceted system that integrated agriculture, trade, taxation, resource management, and limited industry to sustain a growing republic in a harsh and unforgiving environment, providing both the material foundation and political legitimacy for its military campaigns, territorial expansions, and bureaucratic governance. And while it was imperfect, unequal, and sometimes exploitative, it was the engine that enabled the Republic to endure, expand, and assert itself as the preeminent power in the post-war West, shaping the lives of citizens, soldiers, and frontier communities alike, and ensuring that the dream of a reborn California would not remain a fragile ideal, but would manifest as a tangible, functioning, and enduring state capable of facing both internal challenges and external threats. The conflict between the New California Republic and New Vegas represented one of the most politically and strategically complex chapters in the Republic's history, a confrontation that was not merely military but also ideological, economic, and symbolic. For New Vegas, ruled with unmatched precision and technological mastery by the enigmatic Mr. House, stood as a thriving hub of civilization in the Mojave Desert, a city powered by pre-war energy and fortified by the remnants of the Strip, where casinos, mercenaries, and automated defenses created a level of organization and prosperity that rivaled even the most developed NCR settlements, and in doing so posed both a challenge and an opportunity to the Republic's expansionist ambitions. The NCR's interest in New Vegas was driven by multiple factors, foremost among them the city's strategic location controlling access to Hoover Dam, whose hydroelectric power, water, and irrigation potential could secure the Republic's hold over the Mojave, provide essential resources to its growing population, and cement its authority in a region that was as much contested by Caesar's legion as it was coveted for its fertile valleys and trade routes. Yet, while the Republic's expansionist narrative framed the push into New Vegas as a moral imperative to bring law, order, and democratic governance to the desert, the reality was far more nuanced, for New Vegas was already a functioning, self-sufficient entity, led by a ruler whose technological and political acumen far exceeded that of many NCR officials, and who, though morally ambiguous, maintained stability, prosperity, and order in a region the NCR itself had struggled to pacify. Initial NCR interactions with New Vegas involved diplomacy and reconnaissance, sending envoys and scouts to assess the city's defenses, gauge the loyalty of local factions, and attempt to negotiate terms that would integrate the Strip into the Republic without open conflict. Yet these efforts were complicated by Mr. House's insistence on independence, his unwillingness to submit to external authority, and his sophisticated surveillance systems, which allowed him to anticipate NCR movements and prepare preemptive defenses. Simultaneously, local factions, such as the New Vegas Strip's casino owners, the Boomers, and various mercenary groups, presented additional challenges, as each had its own interests, loyalties, and ambitions, and some were willing to cooperate with the NCR, while others aligned with House, creating a tangled web of alliances and hostilities that required careful navigation, intelligence gathering, and occasionally coercion by NCR operatives. As tensions escalated, the Republic began fortifying its positions around the Mojave, establishing camps, garrisons, and outposts that would serve as staging grounds for a potential assault, while simultaneously attempting to secure allegiance from neighboring towns and tribes, offering protection, trade incentives, and promises of representation in exchange for support, thereby consolidating its political and military presence in the desert and creating a buffer zone against House's influence. The military aspect of the conflict was complicated by the presence of Caesar's legion, whose encroachments on the eastern Mojave threatened NCR supply lines and diverted soldiers from direct engagement with New Vegas, forcing the Republic to divide its attention and resources between multiple fronts, highlighting the logistical challenges of projecting power into a desert region hundreds of miles from the Californian heartland. Ultimately, the NCR faced the stark reality that New Vegas could not be subjugated by diplomacy alone, and any attempt to forcibly integrate the city required not only overwhelming firepower, but also careful coordination with local allies, precise timing, and an understanding of the city's sophisticated defensive systems, from turrets and securitrons to hidden vaults and strategically placed sniper positions. It was in this environment that the NCR's strategy evolved into a combination of siege tactics, political negotiation, and intelligence operations designed to undermine Mr. House's control while minimizing civilian casualties and disruption to trade. For the Republic recognized that the capture of New Vegas would be as much about maintaining legitimacy as it was about achieving military objectives, and any overt destruction or oppressive action could damage the NCR's reputation both within the Mojave and back in California. The campaign also illuminated the limits of the Republic's military doctrine, for its soldiers, trained primarily for conventional engagements against raiders and tribal militias, often struggled against House's automated defenses, energy weaponry, and technologically enhanced soldiers, necessitating close coordination with rangers and local operatives who could provide reconnaissance, sabotage enemy systems, and advise commanders on unconventional strategies. Politically, the NCR's pursuit of New Vegas became a focal point of debate within Shady Sands, as legislators, governors, and interest groups weighed the benefits of controlling the city against the risks of overextension, resource depletion, and potential backlash from its residents. And the ensuing debates shaped policy decisions, influenced military appointments, and even dictated the timing and intensity of the Republic's maneuvers in the Mojave. Ultimately, the NCR's conflict with New Vegas was not a simple matter of conquest, but a multi-dimensional campaign involving diplomacy, espionage, economic pressure, and, when necessary, force. And while the city's fall into NCR influence, whether through outright annexation, conditional cooperation, or negotiated compromise, was never entirely guaranteed, the campaign demonstrated the Republic's growing capacity to project power, coordinate complex operations, and integrate disparate groups under its banner, setting a precedent for future territorial expansions. Culturally, the NCR's engagement with New Vegas highlighted the tension between its democratic ideals and imperial ambitions, for while the Republic claimed to offer prosperity, law, and representation, its approach often involved coercion, manipulation, and the imposition of authority over communities that had long managed their own affairs. A dynamic that would recur in subsequent encounters with the Mojave's inhabitants and with hostile factions across the wasteland, underscoring the duality at the heart of the Republic's identity as both liberator and conqueror. Economically, control over New Vegas promised access to the city's wealth, trade networks, and technological infrastructure, enhancing the NCR's capacity to supply its military, maintain frontier outposts, and fund its bureaucratic apparatus. Yet integrating the city's economy also posed challenges, as the Republic needed to reconcile pre-existing commercial systems, independent operators, and unique local currencies with the broader NCR economic framework, balancing centralization with local autonomy to avoid unrest. In sum, the NCR's campaign against New Vegas was a microcosm of the Republic's broader challenges and ambitions, encapsulating the interplay of military might, diplomacy, economic strategy, and political ideology, while highlighting the difficulties inherent in asserting authority over autonomous regions, and the campaign's outcomes, whether eventual incorporation, alliance, or stalemate, would reverberate through the Republic's history, shaping its policies, identity, and approach to frontier governance for decades to come. while offering a stark illustration of the complex realities behind the Republic's narrative of righteous expansion and civilized restoration. The confrontation between the New California Republic and Caesar's Legion represents one of the most defining and morally complex episodes in the Republic's history, a conflict that tested its military capabilities, political resolve, and ethical boundaries, while simultaneously shaping its identity as a regional superpower in the post-apocalyptic West. For the Legion, a highly disciplined, expansionist, and brutally authoritarian society led by the enigmatic Caesar presented not merely a military challenge, but a philosophical one, embodying an ideology that was diametrically opposed to the NCR's democratic principles, emphasizing slavery, absolute obedience, and conquest as instruments of social and political order, and in doing so forcing the Republic to confront the limits of its values in the face of existential threat, originating from the remnants of tribes along the Colorado River and inspired by the organizational structures of ancient Rome. Caesar's Legion rapidly transformed from a loosely connected tribal coalition into a highly efficient war machine, employing strict hierarchical discipline, rigorous training, psychological warfare, and terror tactics to subjugate the Mojave and surrounding regions, making it a formidable adversary for the NCR, whose traditional military doctrine, while effective against raiders and less organized foes, they had to adapt quickly to counter an enemy that combined fanatic loyalty with strategic sophistication. The NCR first encountered the Legion as it expanded westward, clashing over control of the Mojave, key settlements, trade routes, and ultimately the strategic prize of Hoover Dam, whose hydroelectric power and water resources were critical to both factions' survival and long-term influence, and these confrontations immediately highlighted the disparity in tactical philosophy between the NCR's organized, conventional army and the Legion's ruthless, adaptive, and psychologically manipulative forces, who frequently used ambushes, human shields, and terror executions to destabilize NCR positions, demoralize soldiers, and win psychological victories even in the absence of conventional battlefield dominance. Politically, the war with Caesar's Legion was contentious within the NCR itself, as policymakers, generals, and legislators debated the moral and strategic implications of engaging an enemy who practiced slavery, crucifixion, and ritualized violence, questioning whether conventional diplomacy, covert sabotage, or full-scale military engagement was the most effective course, and these debates mirrored the larger tension between the Republic's democratic ideals and the practical necessity of survival, a tension that would recur throughout its campaigns and territorial expansions. Militarily, the NCR's strategy evolved over the course of the Mojave campaign to incorporate both conventional deployments and specialized units, with rangers, scouts, and elite detachments taking on reconnaissance, sabotage, and precision strikes against key Legion leaders and supply lines, while larger army divisions engaged in fortification defense, patrolling trade routes, and securing civilian settlements from both Legion raids and collateral damage, demonstrating the Republic's capacity to adapt conventional structures to asymmetric warfare, even as logistical challenges, communication difficulties, and the vast distances of the Mojave strained its effectiveness and highlighted the limits of its infrastructure. The Legion's societal model further complicated the conflict, for Caesar's ability to inspire near-religious loyalty among his followers created a disciplined, ideologically motivated army willing to endure extreme hardship and commit atrocities in the name of conquest, making negotiation, surrender, or deterrence nearly impossible, and forcing the NCR to rely on overwhelming numbers, firepower, and strategic alliances to counter the Legion's effectiveness, while simultaneously contending with the moral and psychological weight of confronting an enemy whose cruelty was both systematic and ritualized. Key battles, including the protracted skirmishes along the Colorado River, the defense of fortification points in the Mojave, and the ultimate confrontation at Hoover Dam, served as both tactical tests and symbolic contests, with the outcome determining not only territorial control, but also the balance of power in the post-war West, and the NCR's eventual victory, while bolstering its legitimacy and consolidating its control over the Mojave, came at enormous cost in manpower, resources, and political capital, as soldiers fell to ambushes, desertions, and the harsh desert environment, while bureaucratic inefficiency sometimes exacerbated losses and delayed reinforcements, highlighting the persistent tension between ideology, logistics, and battlefield realities. Beyond the military and political dimensions, the NCR's war with Caesar's Legion had profound social and cultural implications, as the conflict forced the Republic to confront the realities of slavery, indoctrination, and systemic brutality, prompting debates about the moral responsibility of victory, the treatment of conquered peoples, and the integration of liberated communities into the Republic's legal and economic framework, while also testing the loyalty and ethical judgment of soldiers, rangers, and administrators tasked with enforcing NCR law in territories formerly dominated by the Legion. The campaign revealed both strengths and weaknesses of the Republic, demonstrating its capacity for large-scale mobilization, alliance building, and territorial administration, while simultaneously exposing vulnerabilities in leadership cohesion, resource distribution, and strategic foresight, as political factions in Shady Sands debated whether the war effort was sustainable, whether territorial expansion should continue beyond the Mojave, and how to balance the moral imperative of defeating a tyrannical foe against the pragmatic necessity of conserving manpower and maintaining domestic stability. Economically, the war with the Legion was both a strain and an opportunity, as the NCR invested heavily in sustaining troops, supplying outposts, and rebuilding infrastructure damaged by conflict, while simultaneously gaining access to new trade routes, settlements, and resources previously under Legion control, enabling the Republic to strengthen its economic base, consolidate taxation networks, and extend the reach of its market system into newly pacified areas. Yet these gains came at the price of extended supply lines, increased vulnerability to raiders and remaining Legion cells, and political friction among local populations unaccustomed to centralized governance. The ultimate resolution of the NCR Legion conflict at Hoover Dam, achieved through the coordinated efforts of conventional forces, rangers, and allied factions, demonstrated the Republic's ability to integrate multiple military, political, and logistical components into a coherent operational framework, while also highlighting the indispensable role of intelligence, adaptability, and local knowledge in overcoming an enemy whose ideological zeal and unconventional tactics rendered standard doctrine insufficient, and whose defeat, while decisive, required constant vigilance to prevent resurgence, infiltration, or sabotage in the post-war administration of newly secured territories. In retrospect, the NCR's confrontation with Caesar's Legion represents not only a pivotal military and territorial victory, but also a critical juncture in the Republic's evolution, defining its approach to asymmetric warfare, alliance management, and frontier governance, while cementing its reputation as the preeminent power in the Mojave and the wider West, demonstrating both the capacities and contradictions of a democratic republic operating in a brutal post-apocalyptic world, forced to reconcile ideals of law, freedom, and justice with the harsh realities of conquest, resource management, and the administration of newly subdued populations, and ultimately shaping the Republic's trajectory for decades to come, as it sought to expand its borders, consolidate power, and assert its vision of civilization over a vast and fractured wasteland. While the military campaigns and territorial expansions of the new California Republic often dominate discussions of its history, the internal political struggles and systemic corruption that pervaded its governance were equally critical in shaping both its successes and failures, for as the Republic grew from a coalition of settlements into a sprawling nation-state, the mechanisms of democracy, bureaucracy, and law that initially served as the backbone of Shady Sands' orderly governance increasingly came under strain, revealing tensions between ideals and practice, between centralized authority and local autonomy, and between the expectations of citizens and the ambitions of political elites, and these tensions often manifested in conflicts over resource allocation, representation, military oversight, and the distribution of power across the Republic's vast territories. From the earliest days of Tandy's presidency, it was clear that political legitimacy in the NCR depended not only on adherence to democratic principles, but also on the ability to manage competing interests among diverse settlements, influential families, merchant conglomerates, and military factions. Yet as the Republic expanded into California's heartland and the Mojave Desert, the sheer complexity of governance created opportunities for corruption, nepotism, and bureaucratic inefficiency, with officials increasingly tempted to leverage their positions for personal gain, to favor allies over merit, or to manipulate regulatory systems to reward certain constituencies while marginalizing others. The growth of the NCR bureaucracy, while necessary to manage taxation, trade, military logistics, and civil administration, also created layers of administration that were often opaque, inconsistent, and resistant to reform, allowing local governors, tax collectors, and military commanders to wield disproportionate influence, sometimes acting independently of Shady Sands, or exploiting loopholes for financial advantage. And while some of these officials genuinely sought to serve the Republic, the systemic incentives frequently favored self-interest over civic responsibility, leading to widespread perceptions of favoritism, graft, and abuse of authority. Military appointments were particularly susceptible to corruption, as officer promotions could be influenced by political connections, family alliances, or the patronage of powerful factions, resulting in instances where commanders were ill-prepared for leadership yet retained authority due to their ties rather than their competence, a phenomenon that frustrated rangers and frontline soldiers, who witnessed firsthand the consequences of poor decision-making, inadequate training, or misallocation of resources, particularly during campaigns in the Mojave, where the stakes were existential. Election cycles and legislative politics further amplified these struggles, as representatives from disparate regions brought competing agendas, lobbying efforts, and personal ambitions into the Republic's governing councils, creating a dynamic in which short-term political maneuvering often overshadowed strategic planning, and where policies were frequently influenced by the desires of influential merchant families, caravan operators, or frontier militias, rather than by an overarching vision of Republican governance. leading to uneven enforcement of laws, inconsistent support for distant settlements, and delayed responses to crises ranging from raider uprisings to natural disasters. Corruption also extended to the economic sphere, where monopolistic practices, embezzlement of tax revenues, and exploitation of labor undermined both economic efficiency and public trust, with some merchants and officials manipulating supply chains, hoarding scarce goods, or diverting military contracts for personal profit, further exacerbating the hardships of frontier communities already struggling with harsh environmental conditions, raider threats, and the demands of military conscription. These dynamics created a recurring tension between the Republic's public narrative as a bastion of law, order, and democratic governance, and the lived experience of many citizens who encountered inefficiency, inequity, and exploitation, a dissonance that fueled cynicism, localized resistance, and occasionally outright rebellion, as disaffected groups questioned whether the NCR's institutions truly served the people or merely reinforced the power of a politically connected elite. The Mojave Campaign, with its enormous logistical and military demands, served to magnify both the strengths and weaknesses of the Republic's political system, as officials in Shady Sands struggled to coordinate the deployment of troops, secure funding, and manage alliances with local communities, while balancing competing factions within the legislature, and the complexity of these tasks sometimes resulted in delayed reinforcements, supply shortages, and inconsistent policy implementation, which, while not fatal to the campaign, highlighted the limitations of the Republic's governance when stretched across vast, hostile territories. Political rivalries also emerged between civilian administrators and military leaders, as generals and governors often clashed over strategy, resource prioritization, and the treatment of conquered populations, creating friction that had both operational and ethical implications, particularly when local commanders acted autonomously in ways that either undermined or contradicted central directives, sometimes exacerbating local resentment or creating openings for raider or tribal resistance. Scandals and episodes of overt corruption periodically erupted, from misappropriation of military funds to the sale of sensitive intelligence to private contractors, and while some of these incidents were investigated and punished, the systemic nature of the Republic's political and bureaucratic structures meant that corruption persisted, often tolerated as an unavoidable cost of administering a sprawling post-apocalyptic nation, and this normalization of partiality, graft, and patronage subtly eroded civic trust, even as it allowed the Republic to maintain operational flexibility in regions where rigid enforcement of law might have been impossible. Despite these challenges, the NCR's political system also demonstrated remarkable resilience, as democratic institutions, elections, and public accountability mechanisms provided channels for reform, debate, and negotiation, allowing grievances to be addressed through formal procedures rather than defaulting to armed rebellion, and creating a sense of legitimacy that differentiated the Republic from the purely authoritarian or predatory entities it often faced in the wasteland, such as Caesar's Legion or the remnants of the Enclave, whose governance relied on fear, coercion, and absolute obedience rather than negotiation and representation. In addition, the Republic's capacity to integrate local leaders, tribes, and frontier communities into formal governance structures, even imperfectly, reinforced its political reach and mitigated some of the destabilizing effects of corruption, as local stakeholders were incentivized to participate in civic processes, contribute to defense and economic networks, and uphold the law in a manner consistent with the Republic's broader objectives, creating a hybrid system that blended centralized authority with localized autonomy, albeit with frequent tensions and inconsistencies. Ultimately, the political struggles and corruption that permeated the NCR were inseparable from its expansionist ambitions, military campaigns, and economic operations. For the challenges of governing a rapidly growing post-apocalyptic state in a landscape of scarce resources, hostile neighbors, and diverse cultural traditions required constant negotiation, compromise, and management of competing interests. And, while these dynamics often undermined efficiency and fairness, they also provided the Republic with a flexible, adaptive framework capable of sustaining large-scale operations, absorbing new territories, and projecting power across the West, even as the ethical, operational, and civic consequences of corruption remained an enduring aspect of its identity, shaping both public perception and internal governance for decades to come. The frontier policy of the new California Republic was a defining aspect of its governance and expansion strategy, reflecting both the ambitions and the limitations of a post-apocalyptic state, striving to assert control over vast, often hostile territories. For as the Republic expanded from its core settlements in California into the Mojave Desert, southern Nevada, and beyond, it became increasingly clear that maintaining authority over distant lands required not merely military conquest, but a comprehensive framework of governance, infrastructure development, resource management, and civic integration. And the frontier policy emerged as a deliberate, albeit imperfect, strategy to balance these competing demands while projecting the Republic's influence across contested regions. At its core, the policy emphasized the establishment of fortified outposts, garrisons, and patrol routes that allowed the NCR to secure trade arteries, protect settlers and caravans, and respond to threats ranging from raider incursions to organized resistance from hostile factions such as Caesar's Legion, while simultaneously providing hubs for the administration of justice, taxation, and civic services, thereby extending the Republic's institutional presence into regions far from the political center of Shady Sands. These outposts, which included Mojave Outpost, Camp Forlorn Hope, and various smaller fortifications along key routes, were strategically placed to control access points, secure water sources, and facilitate rapid troop deployment, serving as both defensive positions and symbols of the Republic's authority, signaling to local populations that the NCR's reach was tangible and enforceable, while also acting as staging grounds for expansion into unsettled or contested areas. Beyond the military dimension, the frontier policy integrated economic incentives, offering trade opportunities, protection for caravans, and access to NCR markets in exchange for local cooperation and allegiance. A pragmatic approach that recognized the necessity of winning hearts and minds alongside controlling territory, and that sought to embed the Republic within the social and economic fabric of frontier communities, rather than relying solely on coercion. Yet the implementation of the frontier policy was fraught with challenges, as local populations were often wary of centralized authority, suspicious of taxation, and reluctant to cede autonomy to distant bureaucrats, while environmental conditions such as harsh deserts, irradiated landscapes, scarce water, and unpredictable weather further complicated logistics, making the supply of food, water, ammunition, and reinforcements a constant concern, and forcing the NCR to develop sophisticated logistical networks, caravan protection strategies, and communication systems that linked frontier outposts with the political and economic center. The Republic's approach to integrating local leaders and indigenous groups into the frontier administration was equally critical, involving negotiations, alliances, and conditional incorporation into NCR governance structures, allowing the Republic to leverage existing social hierarchies and traditional authorities, while gradually imposing its laws, taxation, and civic obligations. Though these efforts often resulted in tensions, misunderstandings, and occasional rebellion when local expectations clashed with the centralized directives emanating from Shady Sands, and when military presence was perceived as oppressive rather than protective, frontier policy also necessitated the development of a legal and administrative framework capable of operating across diverse and dispersed settlements, including the appointment of magistrates, enforcement of NCR law, and adjudication of disputes, a system designed to standardize governance while remaining adaptable to local conditions, and which simultaneously reinforced the perception of legitimacy and control, signaling that the Republic was more than a military power, but a functioning state capable of maintaining order, protecting property, and regulating commerce across vast distances. The challenges of enforcing this policy were compounded by ongoing conflicts with raiders, independent tribes, and hostile factions such as the Fiends or Powder Gangers, who frequently exploited gaps in NCR control, disrupted trade, and threatened the safety of settlers, necessitating a dynamic and responsive military presence that could adapt to asymmetric threats, conduct reconnaissance, and execute targeted strikes without overextending limited resources, and highlighting the delicate balance between offensive operations, defensive stability, and the maintenance of political legitimacy in frontier regions. Moreover, the frontier policy was closely linked to the Republic's broader territorial ambitions for securing the Mojave and establishing a permanent presence around strategic locations such as Hoover Dam, not only provided immediate military and economic advantages, but also reinforced the narrative of manifest destiny that underpinned the Republic's ideological justification for expansion, framing territorial acquisition as both a moral and practical imperative, and providing political cover for aggressive campaigns against hostile factions and independent settlements. The integration of infrastructure into frontier governance was another critical component, encompassing roads, irrigation systems, communications networks, and trade hubs, which facilitated both economic integration and military mobility, enabling the Republic to project authority, sustain supply lines, and maintain connectivity across otherwise isolated regions, while simultaneously creating incentives for local populations to align with NCR governance in order to access these benefits, further embedding the Republic within the social and economic landscape of the frontier. Yet the policy was not purely benevolent, as it often relied on coercion, forced conscription, taxation, and the suppression of dissent to maintain control, and these measures, while effective in extending territorial reach, also sowed resentment and resistance among frontier populations, who sometimes viewed the Republic as an occupying force rather than a legitimate government, a dynamic that foreshadowed later conflicts, both military and political, and highlighted the inherent tension between expansionist objectives and democratic ideals. The frontier policy's interaction with technological and pre-war infrastructure was also significant, as the Republic leveraged existing roads, energy sources, and water management systems to support settlements and garrisons, integrating these assets into its administrative and military framework while simultaneously contending with the limitations of maintenance, scarcity of expertise, and vulnerability to sabotage, illustrating the Republic's pragmatic adaptation to the post-apocalyptic environment and its ability to combine salvaged technology with human capital in order to sustain frontier operations. Socially and culturally, the frontier policy shaped the identity of both NCR settlers and soldiers, fostering a sense of purpose, resilience, and connection to the broader Republic, while simultaneously creating an environment of tension, adaptation, and negotiation, as diverse populations were brought under centralized governance, and as soldiers, administrators, and civilians navigated the complexities of enforcing law, collecting taxes, protecting communities, and integrating disparate cultural traditions into a coherent political framework. Ultimately, the NCR's frontier policy was a multifaceted and dynamic system that combined military strategy, economic integration, political negotiation, infrastructure development, and social governance in order to extend the Republic's authority into contested territories, demonstrating both the ambitions and limitations of post-apocalyptic statecraft and providing a framework for managing the complex realities of expansion in a hostile and fragmented landscape, while simultaneously reinforcing the Republic's identity as a growing, adaptive, and resilient political entity capable of asserting control, projecting influence, and consolidating power across the West, even as the challenges of geography, opposition, resource scarcity, and human resistance continually tested its effectiveness and moral legitimacy. The evolution of technology and military capabilities within the new California Republic was central to its rise as a dominant post-apocalyptic power, as the Republic faced the dual imperatives of defending its expanding territories and asserting control over a landscape populated by raiders, independent tribes, hostile factions, and technologically advanced remnants of pre-war society, necessitating both innovation and adaptation in weapons, armor, logistics, and strategic planning. For while the NCR could rely on numerical superiority and organizational discipline, the extreme conditions of the wasteland demanded technological enhancements to maintain effectiveness, protect personnel, and ensure supply lines, while simultaneously leveraging salvaged pre-war infrastructure, prototypes, and materials to augment the Republic's relatively limited industrial base. At the heart of the Republic's military technology were its advancements in conventional arms, which included the production and standardization of rifles, pistols, energy weapons, and explosives suitable for both infantry and vehicle-mounted operations, with the NCR Rangers often at the forefront of testing, adapting, and deploying these tools in the field, combining pre-war designs with scavenged components to achieve reliability, portability, and lethality across diverse environments, from irradiated urban centers to harsh desert frontiers. Armor technology represented another key development, particularly the adoption and refinement of combat armor and light power-assisted suits for specialized units such as Rangers who required protection without sacrificing mobility, enabling them to engage effectively in both guerrilla operations and conventional battlefield engagements, while also serving as a psychological deterrent to raider and tribal forces who might otherwise underestimate NCR soldiers. The Republic's approach to vehicles and mechanized support, though limited compared to pre-war standards, included the development of Brahmin-drawn carts, modified trucks, and improvised armored transports, which enhanced logistical mobility, enabled rapid reinforcement, and allowed the NCR to project power across long distances, particularly in frontier regions where natural obstacles, radiation, and radar activity impeded movement, and where traditional foot patrols would have been insufficient to maintain security or enforce law. Energy weapons represented a particular technological focus, as the NCR captured and adapted pre-war laser rifles, plasma weapons, and experimental prototypes, training specialized units in their use, and establishing maintenance workshops in strategic garrisons, while integrating energy-based weaponry into both defensive emplacements and mobile operations, providing a significant advantage against conventional raiders and technologically inferior adversaries, though still falling short when confronted by the advanced systems deployed by factions such as the Enclave or Mr. House's Securitrons. The NCR's innovation extended beyond hardware to tactics and organizational doctrine, incorporating lessons learned from decades of frontier conflicts, the Mojave Campaign, and the war against Caesar's Legion, emphasizing combined arms, reconnaissance integration, supply chain management, and rapid response to asymmetric threats, while simultaneously fostering elite units such as the Rangers who could operate autonomously, conduct covert operations, and serve as both shock troops and intelligence agents, demonstrating the Republic's ability to blend technological advancement with strategic flexibility and human adaptability. Communications technology, though often rudimentary, played a critical role in coordinating military and administrative operations across dispersed territories, incorporating radio networks, relay stations, signal protocols, and courier systems to maintain command and control in regions where distance, terrain, and enemy interference threatened coherence. And these networks became increasingly sophisticated as the NCR expanded, allowing for near real-time coordination of troop movements, logistics, and intelligence, and enabling commanders in Shady Sands to influence operations hundreds of miles away. Logistical and supply innovations were equally significant, as the Republic developed systems for storing, transporting, and distributing ammunition, food, water, medical supplies, and technical components, often relying on fortified way stations, protected caravans, and specialized transport units, ensuring that even distant garrisons and frontier settlements could remain operational in the face of radar attacks, environmental hazards, and resource scarcity, and highlighting the interplay between technological capacity and strategic reach in the Republic's operational doctrine. Medical and survival technology also advanced in tandem with military developments, as field hospitals, portable medical kits, and irradiated zone treatments allowed soldiers to recover from wounds and environmental exposure more effectively than their enemies, while preventative measures, vaccination campaigns, and sanitation protocols supported long-term operational endurance, particularly in extended campaigns such as those in the Mojave and Colorado River regions, and provided an essential foundation for sustaining large-scale deployments in challenging environments. The Republic's ability to capture, reverse engineer, and integrate pre-war technologies significantly enhanced its military edge, with key examples including the acquisition of Enclave hardware, the repurposing of Securitron units after the Mojave campaign, and the assimilation of energy-based weaponry and vehicles into both regular and elite units, demonstrating an opportunistic yet systematic approach to technological development that blended scavenged knowledge with indigenous innovation, while also reflecting the Republic's pragmatic recognition that survival and dominance often depended on exploiting the remnants of a more advanced civilization. Training and doctrine development, paralleled technological advancements, as the NCR established specialized academies, ranger schools, and field training programs designed to ensure that personnel could effectively operate advanced equipment, conduct coordinated maneuvers, and respond to unconventional threats, fostering a professional military ethos that emphasized discipline, adaptability, and tactical acumen, while simultaneously reinforcing loyalty to the Republic and providing a career path that integrated merit, expertise, and leadership potential. The interplay between technology and strategy was particularly evident in the Mojave, where the deployment of long-range rifles, energy weapons, automated defenses, and secure communication networks enabled the NCR to engage in complex operations against Caesar's Legion, raider bands, and hostile factions, coordinating multiple units over extended distances, executing combined arms maneuvers, and maintaining control of key terrain such as Hoover Dam, while also mitigating the risk of attrition and supply disruption, highlighting the transformative effect of technological sophistication on military outcomes and political leverage. However, technological advancement was not without challenges, as the Republic faced shortages of skilled technicians, limited access to pre-war components, maintenance difficulties in harsh environments, and the constant threat of sabotage or theft by enemies, requiring careful planning, redundancy, and adaptive problem-solving to ensure that technological advantages could be effectively deployed and sustained, and demonstrating the interdependence of innovation, logistics, and strategic foresight. In sum, the NCR's investments in technology and military advancements were both a response to the threats of a dangerous post-apocalyptic world and a proactive mechanism for shaping the balance of power in the West, allowing the Republic to expand its territory, secure vital resources, integrate frontier communities, and project authority over diverse and often hostile populations, while simultaneously fostering a culture of professionalism, innovation, and strategic thinking within its armed forces, and establishing the Republic as a formidable and adaptive power capable of confronting both conventional and unconventional adversaries in a landscape defined by scarcity, danger, and opportunity. Diplomacy and alliance building were central pillars of the new California Republic's strategy for survival, expansion, and consolidation of power, as the Republic's leaders understood that the challenges of governing a post-apocalyptic West could not be met solely through military might or bureaucratic control, but required nuanced engagement with a diverse array of factions, settlements, tribes, and independent communities, each with its own interests, cultural norms, and strategic value, and that cultivating cooperation, negotiating agreements, and managing conflicts were essential to maintaining stability, securing resources, and projecting influence across contested territories. The NCR's diplomatic approach was multifaceted, combining formal treaties, trade agreements, protective arrangements, and political integration with informal understandings, temporary truces, and personal alliances, a pragmatic blend designed to allow flexibility in the face of rapidly changing conditions, scarce resources, and unpredictable threats, and reflecting a broader understanding that legitimacy in the eyes of local populations could be as important as military dominance in ensuring long-term control and influence. One of the Republic's key diplomatic successes was the integration of smaller settlements and communities into its governance structure, often offering protection, access to trade networks, and representation within the NCR's political institutions in exchange for loyalty and compliance with taxation, laws, and defense obligations, a strategy that both extended the Republic's reach and embedded it within the social and economic fabric of frontier regions, creating incentives for cooperation while fostering dependency on central authority and allowing the NCR to project stability into areas otherwise prone to raider activity, environmental hazards, or factional violence. In addition to settlement integration, the Republic frequently engaged with tribal groups, negotiating treaties, establishing trade relationships, and, in some cases, co-opting local leadership to facilitate governance, though these efforts were complicated by cultural differences, historical animosities, and varying degrees of receptiveness to central authority, requiring negotiators to balance respect for local customs with the imposition of NCR law and policy, a delicate task that could yield both long-term cooperation and episodic rebellion depending on circumstances, leadership, and enforcement practices. Trade-based diplomacy was another critical component, leveraging the Republic's growing economic network to incentivize alliance, provide access to scarce goods, and integrate local economies into a broader market system, allowing both merchants and communities to benefit materially from cooperation, while simultaneously extending the Republic's influence, reinforcing loyalty, and creating interdependence that discouraged defection, resistance, or alignment with hostile factions such as raiders, the Enclave remnants, or Caesar's Legion. The Republic's engagement with other major powers, both within and beyond California, further demonstrated the strategic importance of diplomacy, as interactions with entities such as Mr. House in New Vegas, the Boomers at Nellis Air Force Base, and the independent Vault communities of the Mojave required careful negotiation, intelligence gathering, and occasional coercion, balancing the Republic's desire for expansion and control with the practical necessity of avoiding unnecessary military conflict, minimizing civilian casualties, and maintaining the veneer of legitimacy in the eyes of both allies and the population at large. Military alliances and coordination also played a crucial role in diplomacy, particularly in frontier regions where the Republic's reach was contested, as the NCR often relied on local militias, ranger detachments, and allied factions to supplement regular forces, provide reconnaissance, and secure strategic locations, thereby leveraging diplomacy to enhance operational effectiveness, while simultaneously establishing patterns of loyalty, integration, and dependence that reinforced long-term territorial control, and highlighting the intersection of military capability and diplomatic engagement in the Republic's strategic doctrine. The Republic's approach to hostile or semi-hostile factions required a careful blend of negotiation, deterrence, and conditional engagement, as the NCR often sought to neutralize threats through treaties, the offer of economic incentives, or political recognition, while reserving the option of force should diplomacy fail, a pragmatic approach that minimized unnecessary bloodshed, maintained political legitimacy, and conserved resources while signaling the Republic's capacity to enforce agreements when necessary and demonstrating an understanding that survival and expansion in a fragmented wasteland depended on both persuasion and coercion. Diplomacy was also essential in managing relationships with pre-existing institutions and technological powers, including the remnants of the Brotherhood of Steel, the Enclave, and other technologically advanced factions, as negotiation, compromise, and intelligence exchange could yield access to critical resources, technical knowledge, and military support, while mismanagement of these relationships risked sabotage, armed conflict, or the loss of strategic advantage, emphasizing the delicate balance required to navigate a landscape populated by actors whose capabilities, intentions, and loyalties were both varied and unpredictable. Culturally and politically, successful alliances reinforced the Republic's narrative of legitimacy, presenting the NCR as a stabilizing force, a protector of settlements, and a promoter of prosperity and order, in contrast to the predatory, chaotic, or authoritarian nature of other factions, while also embedding the Republic within local governance structures, economies, and social networks, thereby creating an enduring foundation for loyalty and integration, even as these relationships required continual negotiation, adaptation, and enforcement to prevent deterioration or betrayal. Internal diplomacy within the Republic itself was also critical, as political factions, military leaders, merchant interests, and frontier administrators often held competing visions for the Republic's expansion, priorities, and strategic approach, necessitating constant negotiation, compromise, and coalition building to maintain coherence, prevent internal conflict, and ensure that policies were executed effectively across diverse and geographically dispersed territories, and illustrating that diplomacy was as vital within the Republic as it was in its external relations. In sum, the NCR's diplomacy and alliance strategy was an essential complement to its military, economic, and political systems, enabling the Republic to navigate a complex post-apocalyptic landscape characterized by scarcity, conflict, and diverse actors, while extending its influence, consolidating territorial control, and fostering networks of loyalty, interdependence, and legitimacy, and highlighting that the Republic's endurance and expansion were not merely a function of force or resources, but also of its ability to negotiate, integrate, and maintain relationships across a fractured and dangerous world, creating a stable, adaptive, and resilient political entity capable of sustaining power, projecting influence, and managing the complexities of the post-war West over the course of decades. The legacy and influence of the new California Republic represent the culmination of its centuries-long efforts to establish order, stability, and governance in a post-apocalyptic West, reflecting both the successes and the limitations of a political entity that emerged from humble origins in Shady Sands to become the preeminent power across California, Nevada, and the Mojave, and whose impact extended beyond mere territorial control to encompass military, economic, cultural, and ideological dimensions, shaping not only the lives of its citizens and frontier communities, but also the broader trajectory of human civilization in a fragmented and dangerous wasteland. The Republic's enduring influence can first be seen in the establishment of a cohesive political and administrative structure that allowed disparate settlements, tribes, and communities to be integrated into a single governing framework, creating standardized legal codes, taxation systems, civic institutions, and representative bodies, which provided a measure of stability and predictability in regions previously dominated by raiders, warlords, or isolated survivalist enclaves, and which fostered the perception of the NCR as a legitimate and enduring state, rather than a transient military power or opportunistic faction. Militarily, the NCR's legacy is marked by the creation of a disciplined, professional force capable of both conventional and asymmetric warfare, whose innovations in logistics, tactics, equipment, and organization enabled it to assert control over vast territories, confront existential threats such as Caesar's Legion, and maintain security along critical trade routes and frontier settlements, while simultaneously fostering elite units such as the Rangers, whose reputation for skill, adaptability, and dedication became synonymous with the Republic's strength and operational ethos, serving as both a practical tool of governance and a symbolic representation of the NCR's authority and reach. Economically, the Republic's influence is reflected in the establishment of a functioning market system, standardized currency, and interlinked trade networks that connected urban centers, agricultural settlements, and frontier outposts, allowing resources to flow efficiently, supporting military operations, incentivizing loyalty, and integrating previously isolated communities into a broader economic and social framework, while simultaneously laying the groundwork for future expansion, technological development, and urbanization. Culturally, the NCR's impact can be seen in its promotion of civic identity, democratic ideals, and the narrative of civilized restoration in a chaotic world, fostering a shared sense of purpose and belonging among its citizens, settlers, and allied communities, and providing a counterpoint to the authoritarian, predatory, or tribal models of governance, exemplified by factions such as Caesar's Legion, the Enclave, or independent raider groups, thereby influencing political norms, social expectations, and perceptions of legitimacy across the post-war West. The Republic's diplomatic and alliance-building efforts further amplified its influence, establishing networks of cooperation, negotiation, and conditional integration that extended its reach into the Mojave, southern Nevada, and contested frontier regions, allowing it to shape the behavior, loyalties, and strategic calculations of neighboring powers, while also demonstrating the interplay between military, economic, and political tools in maintaining authority, fostering interdependence, and projecting stability. The NCR's legacy is also inseparable from its challenges and contradictions, as corruption, bureaucratic inefficiency, political infighting, and resource limitations often undermined its ideals, creating disparities between rhetoric and reality, tension between central authority and frontier autonomy, and conflicts between ethical governance and pragmatic necessity. Yet these very challenges illustrate the complexity of administering a sprawling post-apocalyptic nation, highlighting the resilience, adaptability, and strategic acumen required to maintain cohesion, authority, and legitimacy in the face of persistent threats, both internal and external. Technologically, the Republic's influence is evident in its adaptation and integration of pre-war technology, from energy weapons and armor to communication networks and mechanized logistics, which enhanced its military, administrative, and economic capabilities, provided a strategic edge over rivals, and created a model for the integration of technological resources into the operations of a post-apocalyptic state, while simultaneously demonstrating the necessity of technical skill, maintenance infrastructure, and logistical coordination to convert innovation into practical advantage. In terms of territorial governance, the NCR's approach to frontier policy, settlement integration, and resource management created a durable framework for controlling vast and diverse regions, balancing coercion with incentive, centralization with local autonomy, and law enforcement with negotiation, and in doing so, established patterns of administration and civic organization that would influence subsequent efforts to consolidate power in other post-apocalyptic polities, while also providing a precedent for the combination of military, economic, and political strategies in sustaining authority over contested spaces, the Republic's campaigns against hostile factions, particularly Caesar's Legion and Raider networks, further solidified its influence, demonstrating its capacity to conduct large-scale military operations, project authority into distant territories, and shape the political landscape of the West, while also reinforcing its ideological narrative as a force of civilization, law, and order, and providing both a practical and symbolic benchmark for the limits and capabilities of post-war statecraft. Socially, the NCR's integration of diverse communities, promotion of civic responsibility, and enforcement of law created a sense of shared identity and collective purpose, fostering cohesion among settlers, soldiers, and frontier populations, and instilling a model of participatory governance, trade, and civic duty that contrasted sharply with the coercive, hierarchical, or predatory systems of rival powers, while also embedding the Republic's norms, institutions, and values into the daily lives of its citizens, thereby perpetuating influence beyond the immediate reach of its military and administrative apparatus. The Republic's influence also extended to the perception and conduct of other factions, who were forced to account for NCR power, legitimacy, and military capability in their strategic calculations, whether through direct engagement, alliance, avoidance, or submission, demonstrating the intangible yet critical aspect of influence that derives not only from territorial control, but from reputation, deterrence, and the projection of organizational competence, and reinforcing the idea that the NCR's legacy is as much about shaping expectations, behaviors, and norms as it is about material control. Ultimately, the NCR's legacy is defined by a combination of endurance, adaptability, and the creation of systems that facilitated governance, economic stability, military competence, and cultural cohesion in a post-apocalyptic environment, illustrating the complex interplay between ideals and pragmatism, expansion and integration, coercion and cooperation, and order and adaptation, and providing a model of post-war statecraft that, despite imperfections, corruption, and internal contradictions, established the Republic as a formidable and enduring presence whose influence shaped the trajectory of the West for decades, leaving an indelible mark on the political, military, economic, and cultural landscape of the wasteland, and ensuring that the vision of a reborn, organized, and resilient California-centered polity would endure in both tangible governance structures and the collective memory of its citizens, allies, and rivals alike.